Now I'd like to welcome to the show Timothy Sandefur, Vice President for Legal Affairs at the Goldwater Institute. Welcome to Free the Economy, Tim.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about fiscal responsibility and taxpayer protections. We have kind of a strange political and economic tension in this country. So we have, as you and I discussed before, uh, in most states, there are laws and constitutional provisions that say that the state government shouldn't be giving out favors and subsidies to private parties, what sometimes we call cronyism giveaways. Yet a lot of state and local policy making seems to be full of politicians handing out favors and subsidies.
Yeah.
So hopefully by the end of this conversation, we'll figure out how we got here. But first, can you give us a quick background on what is a gift clause and why is that part of state law?
Gift clauses are part of almost every state constitution, and they're provisions that were adopted into these constitutions over the course of the 19th century to prohibit the government from using taxpayer money to subsidize private businesses. And they originated in the 1840s in places like Rhode Island and Ohio and so forth, in response to the growth of internal improvements projects. That's the term for the construction of canals and railroads in the 19th century, which were often financed by government. And these clauses prohibited the government from, the terms they would use were, it prohibited them from lending its credit to any private undertaking. And then over the course of the 19th century, these clauses were made stronger so that they prohibit the government not just from lending its credit, but also prohibit cities from lending their credit or lending anything of value or giving any money or purchasing stock in. And so over the course of the 19th century, they were made stronger and stronger until you got to the strongest of all of them, which is the clause in the Arizona Constitution, and which is the same as what used to be in the Montana Constitution. Montana rewrote their constitution in the 1970s. They got rid of it. But Montana and Arizona have the strongest prohibitions on government subsidies to private business in all American law.
So, we have this long history, like you said, going back to the construction of canals and the early railroads, and uh, so connected to these like big infrastructure projects.
Right.
And so if you look back and at someone who's a historian of the 19th century, of looks back in 19th century America, and they'll say, well, the Erie Canal was a great project because it led
Right.
to westward expansion, economic growth, and everything. And but at the same time, we look at some of these big projects and say, well, they were kind of corrupt because they were sort of giveaways of taxpayer money to the companies that were producing them. So I wonder, can we sort of disentangle between some of these projects that were probably legit, reasonable projects that just should have been privately financed versus ones that maybe were just complete boondoggles that would never have happened without government corruption in the first place?
Oh, yeah. Well, but being liberated from the discipline of the market meant that government was free to subsidize undertakings that were not profitable, that did not pay for themselves. And in fact, in the 1840s, this really led to a crisis when you had several states driven into bankruptcy in the late 1830s and early 1840s due to their excessive financing of these construction projects that very often ended up going nowhere, and the companies would go out of business, and the operators would flee the state and pursued by angry mobs, this sort of thing. And it was in response to these catastrophes, financial catastrophes of the 1830s and 1840s, that you saw a lot of constitutional change. The one that really stands out is the Pennsylvania Main Line, which was a collection of railroads and roads, toll roads, and canals and things that was supposed to be this great thoroughfare, kind of their answer to the Erie Canal. And it never managed to pay for itself. And it was challenged, the legality of it was challenged in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court on the grounds that it violated the state constitution to use my tax money to fund a private business. And the Pennsylvania Supreme Court issued a decision which, in the 1850s, upholding these investments, a case called Sharpless versus Mayor of Philadelphia, which is my candidate for the most important court decision in all of American history, with the exception of Dred Scott. This case became so influential on the question of government financing of these infrastructure undertakings that it led to a lot of backlash among some people, and then on the other hand, a lot of people would cite it in support of these projects. It was so unpopular. The court's ruling was so unpopular in upholding this project that the voters of Pennsylvania amended their constitution by a vote of 90% to prohibit the financing of these kinds of projects going forward. Unfortunately, nobody ever learns their lesson. And so here we are, a century and a half later, still shoveling taxpayer money into a lot of publicly funded boondoggles, these sort of pie in the sky ideas of how, well, this is going to improve the economy. And of course, if it was really going to improve the economy, if these businesses were actually able to pay for themselves and actually were profitable, they wouldn't need a government subsidy. The very
Mhm.
fact that they have to get money from taxpayers, that they have to get the government to coercively subsidize them, is evidence of the fact that these are ultimately inefficient, wasteful projects. But politicians still fall for them time and time again.
Yeah, well, I guess there's sort of the earlier kind of prehistory of corporations before we have what we have sort of like now, the general purpose corporation, where you can kind of you can create a corporation for kind of any legal purpose, something that came out of the 19th century,
Yeah,
whereas before you for certain projects, you had to have a government permission to do almost anything, right? To do any sort
right.
of big government project at all, you had to have special permission. And so it was like you were, the legislature or, in earlier days, the king or parliament would have to give you a grant to do this special thing. And so a big undertaking like that had it was sort of assumed that it would be uh, an explicit and one that it would be you would require explicit permission from the government, but also that it would be often a granted monopoly, right? In
Yes,
order
and that it
to
would be accompanied with government power, such as the power of eminent domain. So a lot of, if you read the old cases, the old Supreme Court decisions from states and federal government, federal courts rather, throughout that period, what you find is they say, well, these corporations enjoy these special powers, including the power of eminent domain, railroads, mills, to build up a dam so you could power a mill, you could flood neighboring property, and so forth. And so the question of public use in eminent domain or public purpose in taxation reflects a real preoccupation of courts at the time over the line between public and private when it comes to creating new infrastructure or other kinds of undertakings. And that's largely traceable to the fact that America really introduced to the world something that had not really existed before, which is the private for-profit business corporation, which owes its existence, as you said, to the early 19th century. Before then, our English great grandfathers, they always assumed that these companies were semi-public undertakings because you had to get a charter from the king to even operate a corporation, and that very fact meant it was a monopoly. And so even in the language of the early 19th century, when you hear like Thomas Jefferson, for example, when he talks about corporations and he says corporations are terrible, he means monopolies. It's just that he's so used to the idea that corporations and monopolies are synonyms, because in his day they were, until you had the advent of the private for-profit business corporation and market competition that then rendered that sort of thinking obsolete, but left us with a legal legacy of allowing the government power to be used either for eminent domain to build a railroad or to finance these undertakings, as in that Sharpless case in Pennsylvania. And what you find is it's really mostly after the Civil War that you have a reaction against that by lawyers and judges and constitution makers trying to rein in this power. And on that point, it's very often it's overlooked. We had really had a constitutional revolution in this country in the period between, say, 1875 and 1900, in that most states held constitutional conventions during that period. Most states either rewrote their constitutions or wrote brand new ones, because we also had the most new states added to the union
right.
during that period since the revolution. So you have this total change in state constitutional law, and many of them include these gift clauses as a way of prohibiting the government from funding private undertakings.
And I think because we have that older shift from every corporation is essentially a special grant from the state and is sort of a de facto monopoly to the general purpose corporation where anyone can make one and risk their own capital if they want for anything that's legal. Uh, we should also kind of make a distinction in the things we're talking about today, which is what we call cronyism or corruption or subsidies and favors, and sort of generic pro-business policies.
Oh
So
yeah.
like having low taxes in general, or having minimal regulation, or having a reliable court system for business disputes, like the state of Delaware is famous for. So many corporations incorporated in Delaware, their chancery court. Um, so what we're sort of objecting to, I think a lot of, conservatives, libertarians, liberty-minded people were objecting to are specific carve outs and special favors for special corporation, for individual corporations or industries, but
Yep.
not these general pro-business policies that make it easy to do business overall.
Absolutely. And in the same vein, when we talk about this period of the late 19th, early 20th century and the populist and progressive movements of that time, we sometimes we come to it with a sort of modern anachronistic stereotypes in our minds that if these people were trying to rein in the power of these powerful corporations, they must have been, in our lingo, left wingers who were opposed to evil business corporations and were were socialists or something like this, and that's absolutely not true. Instead, a lot of the populist and progressive, I mean, some of them were, but a lot of the populist and progressive language of the time, if you look at what they're actually saying, read their actual debates, what they're saying is we want an equal playing field. We want less government interference so that we have more economic freedom. And what we're bothered by is the special favors that these powerful corporations get, particularly, as I mentioned, the power of eminent domain when it came to railroads, and the enormous subsidies. I mean, the scale of the subsidies that were handed out, especially here in the West, in the Western states like Arizona, is mind-boggling. Arizona spent so much money subsidizing railroad corporations, and that means just giving them cash or paying them per mile for construction. Spent so much money doing that it's one reason why Arizona was so late becoming a state. Arizona applied for statehood in the 1890s, and it was rejected in part because the state had gone so much into debt by handing out taxpayer money to private railroads that then never got built. The scandalous examples of these railroads just never being constructed, and when they were built, they were Soviet quality because it was just riddled with cronyism and special favors. So as a result, the Arizona Constitution incorporated this extraordinarily strong prohibition against financing private companies, which is, again, it's not unique to Arizona. Almost every single state has some prohibition of this sort. They very often go ignored is the problem.
Well, yeah, so you have, like you mentioned, the big famous precedent of the Pennsylvania case upholding uh, these sort of policies, but uh, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court is not binding on other states. So what what has happened in that sort of like that second half of the 19th century, I guess, leading up to the 20th century, where, like you said, you had a lot of states drawing up new constitutions. You had a lot of states having revisions to their constitutions by constitutional conventions. Uh, the vast majority of them adopting some sort of taxpayer protections like this. Did a lot of the other states' court systems and state supreme courts go the same way as Pennsylvania and say, oh, well, actually, it doesn't really matter?
Well, some of them did going in the lead up to these reforms. So the other big scandalous one was in California in a case called the Stockton and Visalia Railroad, which was another enormous boondoggle that cost taxpayers millions. The state Supreme Court said, "Meh, fine with us. Judicial restraint. We're not going to be activists. We're going to let the government hand out this money if it wants to." And it was so unpopular that it was one of the causes of the state holding a constitutional convention about 5 years later and writing the current Constitution of California, which also includes not just a gift clause, by the way, but as you mentioned, several other taxpayer protections, such as prohibitions on special legislation, that is, a law that targets one particular class or narrowly defined group of people as opposed to the general public, or laws against special privileges and immunities. That's what we have that clause in the Arizona Constitution, and it's a variety of different prohibitions on government subsidization of businesses. And then in the years to come, sure enough, what you find is a much more competitive, private-oriented economy that is more concerned, as it ought to be, with satisfying consumers instead of impressing politicians, with providing quality products at low prices instead of trying to win friends and influence people at the Capitol building. And that's how, of course, how an economy ought to work. And that's one reason why you see the enormous explosion in prosperity and innovation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Unfortunately, what you then had was the rise of the doctrines of judicial restraint, beginning with the Progressive Era and climaxing in the New Deal, when courts started to back away from those kinds of protections and stopped enforcing a lot of these provisions, such as the gift clause. We are very fortunate in Arizona that our courts have been pretty good about enforcing this prohibition against government subsidies of businesses, but most states have not been. In most states, the courts have adopted this rational basis test, which, by the way, was manufactured by the federal courts in the 1930s. And for some reason, state courts have been adopting it to interpret their own state constitutions that were written in the 1890s. It makes no sense at all. But anyway, they started using these rational basis rules to say, if the government thinks it's a good idea to subsidize this business, that's good enough for us. And so most states do not have effective gift clauses today, even though they're written into their constitutions.
So basically saying that if there's any rational reason for this program to exist, then it can go forward, even if it's corrupt and counter to our state constitution.
Yep, that's the rule that's been adopted in most states today, unfortunately.
Well, so it's interesting. So we have the business people here, as far as the dynamics that produces the situation. We have the business people who obviously, a lot of them would love to get subsidies and handouts if it could. You've got the courts who are sort of, as you just explained, engaging in an excess of restraint and not enforcing some of these constitutional provisions as well. Maybe they maybe should. But of course, we have the most important mover of all, which is the policymakers and the state legislators who are writing these rules, and passing this legislation, the kind of legislation that provides these subsidies, handouts, cronyism. And this is something that I've always thought was very funny, that when it comes to private businesses getting special favors, everyone always blames the business, or
Yeah.
at least 90% of the blame goes to the business, and not to the people who actually make it possible, right? Because, I, as the CEO of, Corrupt Railroad Incorporated, could be lobbying for years and years to get a handout, but I can't make that happen on my own. It's
Not
the
only
government
that,
policymakers that actually make it happen and give the money away.
oh, it's even worse than that, because as the president of Corrupt Railroad Incorporated, you have a fiduciary duty to your shareholders to get the best deal that you can and make your company as profitable as you can. And so if the government's handing out subsidies left and right, and you refuse to apply based on your own political views, that arguably violates your obligation as the president of the railroad company. So, the real blame, absolutely, it lies with the politicians who ignore the constitutions that they have taken an oath to support. And of course, with the courts in those states that have turned their noses up and said, rational basis. If the politicians think it's a good idea, that's good enough for us. Which, if you think about it, what that does is that turns the gift clause into an anti-bribery statute. That's all that does. If you say that as long as a politician thought it was a good idea to subsidize the economy, then it's not an unconstitutional gift. That the logic of that is that the only thing that does violate the gift clause is an actual handout, an actual bribe. But the bribery is already illegal. So if that's the interpretation, then what you're doing is making the Constitution redundant of the already existing rules against bribery, which obviously cannot be what the Constitution was intended to do. It was intended to prohibit the government from subsidizing private business, even when, in fact, specifically when politicians think it's a good idea. If you think about it, so take, for example, the Arizona Constitution's language. It says it prohibits the government from giving or lending money or other things of value to a private company, quote, by subsidy or otherwise, end quote. That's a good big catch-all language, right? Well, the word subsidy means that the government is funding something because it thinks it's a good idea. That's just what the word means. So if you were to interpret that to mean that it's not unconstitutional for the government to give somebody money if it thinks it's a good idea, That's completely illogical because a subsidy is precisely when the government thinks it's a good idea. And what the Constitution does is it says, aside from everything else, one thing they're not that the legislator is not allowed to do is to give money to a company because he thinks it's a good idea, because we the voters don't think it's a good idea, right? So all sorts of illogical sort of ignoring of the text goes on in these rational basis cases, and unfortunately in a lot of states really has neutered what was one of the strongest protections against taxpayers being fleeced for the benefit of politically influential businesses.
Right. And and I think, in my mind, when I think about this, I almost take it for granted. Maybe both of us do, but it's worth saying that there's a lot of economic literature out there that has studied what are the actual economic effects of
Right.
subsidies, special, what they call targeted economic incentives for businesses. And it's not very great, right? Because if you ask the people who are the head of the state economic development board or whoever in the legislature voted for this new subsidy, they'll say, "Oh, well, we're supporting jobs, we're supporting the local community, we want to grow our economy. When this big company is going to come in and they're going to start a factory and they're going to make EV batteries or whatever, or microchips, and it'll be great for everyone. What are you talking about? This is a great idea." Um, lots of economists over many decades have looked at this and said, like, no, this is like one, that's not the reason why most businesses open up new facilities in the first place, right? They're basically getting an extra gift because they were already going to open a factory, in your city or town for some other important reason.
Right.
Um, it disadvantages local businesses that don't get, right, that are already in
Yep.
existence, that are not getting the special incentive, and and on and on. And there there's some great research from the Mercatus Center, George Mason University, that's done a lot of stuff just in the past few years on this. But uh, the sort of dispassionate analysis has said that all of these kind of feel good, self-serving excuses for why we're doing this don't really bear out, right?
That's right, and it's not just the economic question either, because the economics again. If this company was going to be profitable, it would not need to go to the government and ask for a handout. It's the very fact that it's asking for a handout is prima facie reason to believe that it is not going to succeed because it hasn't been able to get a loan from a private bank, and that's why it's having to get a loan from the taxpayer. Why could it not get a loan from the private bank? Because the bank said it's not going to make money. It's too big a risk, or it's more profitable to put our money elsewhere or something. And that's why you need the government to come in and strong arm people instead. But aside from the economic question, there's also the social question, the social consequences, which I think these are more devastating than the economic ones, which is it creates a culture that rewards people for their political influence, and cronyism, as we've said. Cronyism, what that does is it creates an old boys network that excludes outsiders. And this is particularly harsh against newcomers, immigrants, startups who don't know anybody, who want to disrupt the business world, who have a really cool new idea. They don't have friends down at the state legislature to get favors for them. And what happens is, as generation after generation passes and more handouts and subsidies continue, and it's always done friends of friends or family members who benefit from these subsidies, and you develop a class of outsiders and a class of insiders, which just destroys democratic legitimacy. It makes it so that citizens do not respect or appreciate their government, do not look upon the government as a neutral umpire, but instead looks upon it more and more as just the tool of the insider class. We saw it throughout the 19th century with the rise of socialist and communist rhetoric, of course, but it's also got a racial dynamic to it, right? If you're an outsider, member of a racial minority who's unpopular, you're not going to get a handout, and some other guy gets the handout. That's got to make you resentful, and then you pass on that resentment to your friends and your kids, and that generates over the years this attitude of hostility and distrust toward a democracy that is just very dangerous.
Well, yeah, and I remember an anecdote that a longtime CEO was telling at a at a conference I was at recently, and he'd been used to doing business in, shall we say, a highly regulated state where the state legislature leaders in the state legislature tend to exert a lot of influence over big business proposals, and it might have been Illinois. Um, but he was used to having to go to like the majority leader of the state legislature to, have to like have a sort of unofficial off the record conversation about how are we going to do investments and where are we going to
Yeah.
invest. And then, one day he ended up with a new venture in another state that had a much more sort of free market approach to things. And he was talking to his business partner in this new free market state. And he said, okay, well, we get a lot of money to invest in this new project. When do we have to go down to the state capitol and talk to those people? And his business partner looked at him like he was crazy. He's like, what are you talking about? You don't have to do that. You just have to build your factory.
Wow.
and
It
and
must have
and
been a
so
real weight off his shoulders.
but like you said, that over time that builds a sort of culture of um also almost forced cronyism, right? Even if
Yeah,
you're not the person out there seeking subsidies, you won't want to give away. You just want to do your business, but you kind of have to like court the right politicians in order to
absolutely.
grease the skids to make sure there's no pushback in the future.
Yeah, that's right.
And and so, one thing I'm thinking about, like, well, what is the solution? What is the way forward here? And I'm thinking again what you said about the big Pennsylvania Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court of that state said these deals are legal. These deals do not uh, violate the state constitution. They can go forward, but that leaves the opportunity for a pushback, right? The state legislature could legislate further. Individual states or counties or whatever, these days economic development districts can say we are forswearing this strategy. We're not going to do it. We're not going to do giveaways, even though it's allowed. Um, can it and it really reminds me of the pushback to one of those really bad decisions, the Kelo versus City of New London decision in 2005, where the Supreme Court said, actually, it is okay for a city to like take someone's property via eminent domain for
Right.
commercial use just because we have some economic development idea that we want, some company to come in and get this property. So we're going to like allow them to use eminent domain to take that property. For people who are fans of property rights, that was not a great decision, but it did inspire dozens of states, I think the majority of states, to pass some sort of rules in the sort of years after that, saying, oh, well, even though the Supreme Court says it doesn't violate the federal constitution, we in our state are going to say, well, we don't want to do this, or we're going to restrict it to some extent.
Yep.
And and so just because something in the Constitution doesn't make a good policy and doesn't mean you can't oppose that policy for other reasons or at other levels of government.
Oh, yes. And it's not just statutory changes. You can amend your state constitution. And of course, you can persuade judges to take a second look at old legal precedents. I mentioned that these clauses, these gift clauses that are in state constitutions prohibit these kinds of subsidies. It's only that in a lot of states, judges have misread them. And so there's no reason why new judges couldn't take a second look at those precedents and say, we were really a little too loose in our interpretation here. If you look at the history, actually, there's really good reason to say that these clauses prohibit these kinds of subsidies across the board. Kelo, the eminent domain case, is a great example of the kind of, we often don't think about eminent domain as a form of subsidy. But that is what happens, is when the government allows a private business to use eminent domain, or if it uses eminent domain and then hands the property over to a private business in order to get that property for cheap, that's just a way of subsidizing the business by giving it free or reduced price land. And once again, that happened all the time in the 19th century, particularly with railroads, but also with things like mines, particularly in the West. You had states where mining was a huge deal. You got to connect your mine to a railroad in order for it to be profitable, or you need a lot of water for mining, so you might connect it to an irrigation ditch, so you're going to dig a ditch across somebody else's land. So isn't that taking one person's property and giving it to another? And many courts said yes, but also a lot of courts said no, that's okay. And when they said it was okay, a lot of people got really irritated by that and changed their state constitutions to prohibit that also. The strongest prohibitions are in places, especially in the West, places like Colorado, Arizona, Washington State, have prohibitions. Not just the Fifth Amendment says you can take property for public use. These constitutions specifically say you cannot take property for private use. And they even go further. Some of these constitutions say if there's a dispute between over whether something is a public use or a private use, the judges are not allowed to defer to the government. That's really strong language in some of these constitutions. So that's also a product of this move in the late 19th century to try and prevent the government from picking favorites in the economy. It's not a left right thing in today's political language. This was something that was viewed as populist and progressive precisely because it was pro free market.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of the time we sort of forget about that history and we lose sight of that fact because of our own preconceptions about politics. But the reality is that our ancestors understood that a free market is good for the little guy. It's good for the startup. It's fairer for the taxpayer. It's fairer for the worker, for the government to not be in there trying to decide who should prevail in the marketplace.
All right. So if you had a state that had one of these gift clauses, like I say, almost all the states have some sort of clause like this, and but the that state's court hasn't been enforcing it or taken it very seriously. Uh, should they? Imagine we're just giving advice to someone in trying to change their state's constitution. Should they take Arizona's clause? Because you said that was a very strong one, and just and sub it in. Because I wonder how do you do that if you already have a clause in your state constitution that says you shouldn't be doing this. Do you just write it say no we really mean it no we you really shouldn't be doing this we double extra plus mean you shouldn't be doing it.
You know what's funny is I'm currently working on a project on the mandatory clauses of state constitutions. That is, some states, I think 6 states, have clauses in their constitutions that say everything in this constitution is mandatory, which is kind of odd if you think about it, because you would assume that everything in the Constitution is mandatory. But no, if you look in the history, the reason why is because they were doing just what you said. They actually wrote clauses into their constitutions that said, and we really mean it. So that might not be a bad idea. But some states, after Kelo, we mentioned Kelo, after Kelo, some states did even go so far as to amend their constitutions. Texas, for example, changed their constitution to define the term public use in language that is so well done that it really does limit the use of eminent domain for private benefit, and that was a huge step forward. But yes, there are ways you can change your constitution. You can change the case law by going to court, and that process begins with looking at the history, at the application of these clauses in previous cases, so that you're able to make the case that in the past courts have not really enforced these clauses the way they ought to be, and it's time for us to reconsider that precedent. That's a step-by-step process for lawyers out there. And then, of course, to persuade the legislature to respect these things. In Arizona, we passed a ballot initiative after the Kelo decision that prohibits the government from using eminent domain for private use, and also requires compensation if the government reduces your ability to use your private property through a regulation. We did that by ballot initiative. And as a result, the statute is actually more protective of private property rights in Arizona than the Constitution is at present. And that's just an indication of how there are all sorts of different ways to remedy this problem. But in the long run, the only true solution is for people to understand why government should not be in the business of choosing which businesses get to prosper and which don't, of selecting which companies get to operate and which don't, giving taxpayer money. Giving taxpayer money to a business is all that it means is you're forcing me, the taxpayer, to become a shareholder in a company, which I don't necessarily want to do. And it would be just as wrong for you to take money out of my wallet and go buy Nike shares with it as it would be for you to, every April 15th, take my tax money and take out some money and turn around and hand it over to Nike. It's the same thing. And so it really, the ultimate change can only come about if citizens recognize how wrong that is and realize what we need is a free playing field, not an equal playing field, a free playing field where people can succeed or fail in the marketplace based on their skills, on their merits, and not on who they know down at the state capitol building.
All right, excellent. Um, well, thank you, Tim, so much. This has been a great conversation, and I think we've given a lot of motivation to would-be state constitution modifiers out there.
I hope so.
All right, before we go, Why don't you tell us where can we find you, your work? I know you and the Goldwater Institute and all your colleagues there do lots of excellent work. Where do we find you online and social media?
You can find us at goldwaterinstitute.org. And we have a blog there where I recently linked the two articles, in depth articles have written just recently about the history of the gift clauses and how they are currently applied in state courts to give you all the information you need from the 19th century on.
All right. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.